At the outer gate, the prison guard received a call from the prison supervisor. The supervisor informed him there was a bomb in Building 1 and ordered him to open the prison gates and bring a van to the building immediately. The prison was surrounded by fences, and its entrance consisted of 2 gates positioned one after the other. According to prison regulations, both gates could never be opened at the same time. But this was an emergency. There was a bomb in the building. Breaking protocol, the gate guard opened both gates simultaneously. A van drove into the prison and headed straight for the building with the bomb. The bomb squad emerged, wearing their heavy protective suits, carrying the bomb with extreme caution. One of them sprayed it with a fire extinguisher, trying to cool it down to prevent an explosion. The bomb squad placed the bomb inside the van and immediately drove out of the prison through the open gates. The guards watching the scene felt a wave of relief. They believed they had just averted a disaster, but what they didn't realize was that this was only the beginning of the catastrophe. The bomb squad of 6 individuals who had just exited the prison through the open gates were not a bomb squad at all. They were inmates. And not just any inmates, these 6 were death row prisoners, murderers. Some were even serial killers. Now, 6 dangerous criminals were on the loose, willing to do anything to keep their newfound freedom. I don't need to tell you how crazy things got after that. But even before all of this, how did they pull off this elaborate ruse? Where did the bomb come from? How did they get out of their cells? And where did they get the bomb squad uniforms? If you want answers, stay tuned. In 1984, in one of America's high-security prisons, an incident occurred that would go down in history. Our story takes place in the state of Virginia, specifically at Mecklenburg Correctional Center, a maximum security prison. Within its walls was a special section known as Unit C, housing death row inmates. This was the unit and the building where the unimaginable happened. On May 31, 1984, at precisely 11 p.m., 6 death row inmates executed a daring escape. The moment the breakout was discovered, it triggered a massive response across all levels of law enforcement. Police, the FBI, and even the state governor, who had been sound asleep, were immediately alerted. This was unprecedented. Never before in American history had death row inmates successfully escaped from prison. The stakes were impossibly high. 6 convicted killers were now on the loose, and there was no room for error. The manhunt began instantly. Helicopters filled the skies, patrol cars swarmed the streets, and officers with trained dogs started combing the area. The search radius spanned several kilometers around the prison. The National Guard and military were placed on high alert. Virginia's FBI office dispatched their top investigators to lead the case. The urgency was palpable. Every official feared for the safety of the public. If any civilian encountered these fugitives, the consequences could be disastrous. These men had nothing to lose. They were already sentenced to death, with no fear of punishment or remorse. Killing someone, whether out of necessity or sheer cruelty, was entirely within their capacity. When the investigators arrived at the prison, they were met by the warden, who began recounting the events. Inside Unit C of Building 1, the scene was pure chaos. The place was turned upside down. Guards had been overpowered, tied up, and locked away. The inmates had taken full control of the unit. The investigators knew they were dealing with a meticulously planned operation. The question was, how had these death row inmates pulled it off? When investigators asked the warden about the identities of the escaped inmates, the response was chilling. As mentioned earlier, all 6 were convicted killers, but 2 of them stood out as particularly dangerous. These 2 were brothers, James Briley and Brown D. Linwood Briley D. The Briley brothers were the leaders of a notorious gang, and their body count was staggering, somewhere between 11 and 20 victims. Authorities couldn't even pinpoint the exact number. Their crimes were shockingly brutal. Here's just one example. In one of their heinous acts, James Briley assaulted a woman in front of her husband and their 5-year-old son. Afterward, he murdered the entire family, including the child. The third fugitive was Earl Clanton, whose crimes were equally horrifying. He killed an elderly woman, was granted parole while awaiting trial, and during this period committed yet another murder. His second victim was a school librarian whom he stabbed 8 times in the head. Then he strangled her to death with her own belt. The fourth escapee was Dahat. Lemtugultiti Tatit, who had also targeted elderly women. He murdered 2 women over the age of 60, leaving a trail of terror in his wake. The fifth inmate, Derek Peterson Halosh, robbed a supermarket, stealing $6,000. Afterward, he killed the store manager in cold blood. Finally, there was Willie Jones, whose crime was perhaps the most chilling of all. He broke into the home of an elderly couple, killed the husband, and then forced the wife to pray before murdering her as well. To cover his tracks, he set their house on fire. By now, the gravity of the situation was clear. These 6 men were not just dangerous, they were predators. The authorities were terrified of what might happen if they weren't caught quickly. The lead investigator on the case was confident they would eventually capture the fugitives, but his biggest fear was that they would harm more innocent people before being stopped. Outside the prison, search efforts were in full swing. Police officers across the state were mobilized, with roadblocks and checkpoints set up on highways. The search radius continued to expand as every passing hour increased the likelihood that the fugitives had traveled farther. The escapees were believed to be driving a vehicle, but no one knew which direction they had taken, north, south, east, or west. At this point, the investigators were desperate for any lead, no matter how small, that could point them in the right direction. The first thing the investigators did was head to a Section CB, the wing where the escape had taken place. What they found was utter chaos. The section was turned upside down, and as mentioned earlier, the guards had been found tied up and locked in the very area they were supposed to be guarding. The investigators began by thoroughly searching the cells the inmates had escaped from. They combed through every inch, looking for clues or evidence that might reveal where the fugitives had gone. But to their frustration, they found nothing. No notes, no maps, no leads. What they did find, however, was deeply unsettling. Homemade weapons. The inmates had crafted knives and sharp tools by hand, hiding them in clever spots. One knife, for instance, was concealed in the leg of a table. This discovery confirmed a grim reality. The escapees were armed. Sure, they only had makeshift weapons, but the fact that they were armed at all made them even more dangerous. After completing their search of the cells, the investigators turned their attention to the guards who had been tied up in Section C. Their first question was whether the guards had overheard anything. Perhaps the inmates had discussed their plans or mentioned where they were headed, but the guards insisted they hadn't heard a thing. According to them, the inmates had been silent about their destination. This lack of information raised suspicions among the investigators. Could one of the guards have helped the inmates escape? After all, Section C was supposed to be a high-security area with measures in place to prevent exactly this kind of incident. The investigators were well aware that prison guards were often vulnerable to bribery. Their salaries were modest, their work conditions were grueling, and many guards frequently complained about being assaulted by inmates. The investigators pressed the guards for details, asking how the inmates had managed to overpower them, steal their uniforms, and escape the building so easily. That's when the guards revealed something intriguing. 2 months earlier, one of the inmates in Section C had sent an anonymous letter to the state prosecutor's office. The letter warned of a bomb hidden in Section C, claiming that some inmates planned to use it to escape. The sender's identity was never discovered, but the warning prompted the prison warden to order a full-scale search of Section C. A team of supervisors and guards, accompanied by sniffer dogs, had gone through the cells one by one. They removed the inmates, searched their belongings, and even brought in specialized equipment. But despite their efforts, they found no trace of a bomb or any materials that could be used to make one. The anonymous letter sent by the inmate had been explicit. It claimed that a bomb was being prepared as part of an elaborate escape plan. The letter also mentioned that the plan included overpowering guards and stealing their uniforms to disguise themselves. At first glance, the letter seemed like a genuine warning from an inmate trying to expose the conspiracy, but the investigators were beginning to suspect otherwise. This so-called tip-off wasn't an act of whistleblowing at all. It was part of the escape plan itself. The letter had been designed to plant the idea of a bomb in the minds of the guards, ensuring that when the escapees used the bomb as a diversion, it would be immediately believed. Meanwhile, the guards were busy trying to calm the inmates and restore order. Moments later, the commotion suddenly died down. The inmates stopped their yelling and shoving, acting as if nothing had happened. Why? Because their plan had worked. Earl was now in the restroom, exactly where he needed to be, and the guards had no idea. Since the guards hadn't done a head count when the inmates entered, they didn't realize one of them was missing. The inmates knew this weakness in protocol and had exploited it perfectly. Once the chaos subsided, the guards opened the gate to the cell block and escorted the inmates inside, leaving the gate area. Meanwhile, Earl Clanton remained hidden in the restroom, completely unnoticed. Sometime later, one of the guards tried to open the restroom door, but the lock wouldn't budge because Clanton was holding it shut from the inside. When the guard mentioned this to the gatekeeper, the response was dismissive. "Just find another restroom." This casual attitude ignored a crucial prison rule. Any stuck or locked door was supposed to be immediately reported to maintenance for inspection, but this protocol, like many others, was simply overlooked. Building 1 in the prison was divided into 3 sections. A, B, and C. Section C housed death row inmates. This section was further divided into 2 zones of cells, separated by the control room where the gatekeeper operated the doors. According to the gatekeeper, the escape plan started when one of the inmates knocked on the window to get his attention. The inmate was holding a book and claimed he wanted to pass it to another inmate in the second cell zone. The 2 zones were separated by the control room. The inmate used the phone connecting the cell zone to the control room and told the gatekeeper he wanted to give the book to James Briley, one of the notorious Briley brothers. The gatekeeper agreed, saying he'd deliver the book. He stepped out of the control room, closing the door behind him, but not completely. Instead, he left it slightly ajar, a habit the inmates had observed and planned to exploit. While this was happening, the inmates in the cell zone were preparing for their escape. One of them, Willie Turner Dool, was particularly skilled at crafting makeshift weapons. He could turn scraps of metal into knives, sharpening them with stones or other materials. He scavenged metal from bathroom fixtures or door edges and worked tirelessly to make them razor sharp. Turner had developed countless techniques for crafting these deadly tools, and his resourcefulness became a critical part of the escape plan. Willie Turner had another remarkable skill, hiding his weapons in ingenious ways. He concealed them in books, under tables, and in places so clever that guards often failed to find them. Investigators believed that Turner was the mastermind behind the entire escape plan. He was, without a doubt, the sharpest of them all. However, it's important to note that Willie Turner Bamat was not the same person as Willie Jones Wanadin, one of the 6 escapees. In fact, Turner wasn't planning to escape at all, despite being the key architect of the plan. We'll delve into that detail later. For now, Turner distributed the handmade weapons and knives he'd crafted to his fellow inmates, instructing them to get ready. The plan was about to unfold, starting with the book. As we mentioned earlier, the gatekeeper had agreed to deliver the book. When he left the control room, leaving the door slightly ajar, he retrieved the book from the first inmate through the slot in the cell door. Then, he walked over to the opposite door to hand the book to the second inmate in the other cell zone, James Briley. When James received the book, he raised his voice and said loudly, "Thanks for the book." This wasn't just a casual expression of gratitude, it was the signal Earl Clanton had been waiting for in the restroom. The moment Clanton heard those words, he sprang into action. He burst out of the restroom, rushed into the control room, and hit the button that opened all the cell doors in the block. In an instant, chaos erupted. The cell doors swung open, and the inmates poured out, armed with the weapons Turner had prepared. The guards didn't stand a chance. Within moments, the inmates had overpowered them. The tables had turned. The guards were now prisoners, and the prisoners were in charge. The inmates quickly tied up the guards, stripping them down to their underwear. They confiscated the guards' batons, their only weapons, and even took their wallets and cash. Section C was now entirely under the inmates' control, and the escape was well underway. Now that the inmates had full control of Section C, they isolated it from the rest of the prison. The next step in their plan was to capture a high-ranking officer. The guards they had overpowered so far were low-level and didn't have the authority to, for example, order the opening of the main gates. For that, they needed someone with higher clearance. Under duress, the inmates forced one of the captured guards to call a lieutenant stationed in another building of the prison. The guard, following their orders, told the lieutenant there was an emergency in Section C. A serious fight had broken out between two inmates, and one of them was critically injured. He urged the lieutenant to come and handle the situation personally. However, the lieutenant was too far from Section C to respond immediately. Instead, he sent the officer in charge of the shift, a lower-ranking official, to investigate. When the officer arrived at Section C, he saw what appeared to be a guard stationed at the gate control room. Unbeknownst to him, this was no guard. It was one of the inmates dressed in a stolen uniform, pretending to be the gatekeeper. As soon as the officer entered, the inmates ambushed him. They quickly restrained him, leaving him no chance to call for help. Afterward, they stripped him of his uniform and locked him up with the other captured guards. Using this same tactic, the inmates continued to lure guards and officers of various ranks into Section C. Each time, the new arrivals were overpowered, stripped of their uniforms, and thrown into the cells alongside their colleagues. Their plan wasn't limited to officers. They even captured the nurse assigned to their section. The nurse was terrified, and the inmates locked her in a cell. Things took a darker turn when Earl Clanton, one of the escapees, entered her cell with the intent to assault her. The nurse's terrified screams echoed through the block, reaching the ears of the captured guards. Hearing her cries enraged them, boiling their blood as they sat helplessly in their cells. Moments later, James Briley joined Clanton in the cell, seemingly intent on aiding him in his heinous act. But just as things were escalating, another inmate stormed into the cell. He began shouting at Clanton and Briley, ordering them to stop. Then, the mastermind behind the entire escape, Willie Turner, stepped in. He looked at the chaos unfolding and said, "Is this really what you want to do now, right in the middle of our operation? Do you have no brains?" His words made the other criminals stop their actions, and they left the nurse unharmed. The nurse, who had been among the captured guards, later gave her testimony to the investigators, recounting the terrifying events. The investigators, piecing together the details from the guards' statements, were beginning to form a clearer picture of the escape. But even as the investigators worked, the criminals were still on the run, and there was no trace of them. 2 hours had passed since the escape, and the police knew that the longer they took to find the criminals, the harder it would be to track them down. They expanded the search area every half hour, with all available resources and law enforcement personnel in the state mobilized. But despite their efforts, there was no sign of the escapees. The investigators continued questioning the guards and officers, each describing how they had been overpowered and restrained by the inmates who were disguised in the guards' uniforms. As soon as they captured a guard, they would take his uniform and use it to lure more guards into their trap. According to the guards' testimonies, James Briley, one of the brothers involved in the escape, had initially wanted to kill some of the guards. He was concerned that too many guards would make it difficult to control the situation. However, Willie Turner, the mastermind, convinced him to abandon the idea, warning that any additional killings would complicate their escape further. Now, let's return to the lieutenant, the supervisor of the prison. He had been contacted earlier, but had sent a lower-ranking officer in his place. The lieutenant, growing increasingly concerned, tried to reach the guards in Section C to check on the situation. However, no one answered the phone. Even the officer he had sent to investigate didn't return with any updates. Confused, the lieutenant decided to go to Section C himself to find out what was going on. When he arrived, he was shocked by the sight of the place turned upside down. Instead of entering through the main door, he took the stairs since he had keys to all the doors. Being the supervisor, it was natural for him to have access to everything. As the lieutenant entered through the stairwell, the door slammed shut behind him automatically. He was suddenly ambushed by the inmates who were disguised in guard uniforms. They quickly overpowered him, restraining him and locking him away with the others. Now that they had captured a prison supervisor, a lieutenant, this would make their escape plan much easier to execute. The inmates, now in control of Section C, began to put their escape plan into motion. The first thing they did was lock up the guards in the janitor's room within Section C and secure the door. The lieutenant, however, was taken with them. Even though they controlled the control room for Section C, which managed the doors within the section, there was still one major obstacle: the control room for the main entrance of Building 1. This control room, which managed the main entrance gate, was locked, and the only way the inmates could access it was if the guard inside opened it for them. To make this happen, the inmates forced the lieutenant to call the guard on duty in that control room. They instructed him to tell her that another guard would be coming to relieve her. The moment the guard heard the voice on the phone, she immediately recognized it as the lieutenant's. Although it was unusual for someone else to replace her during her shift, she didn't question it. After all, her direct superior had given the order. So, the guard opened the door, not realizing that the men entering were actually disguised inmates, one of them being the notorious criminal Clant, along with Derek Peterson. They quickly subdued the guard, restrained her, and took control of the control room. Now, the inmates had control of all the doors in Building 1, but there was still one major hurdle: the main prison gate. This gate consisted of two large doors that were supposed to never open simultaneously. However, with the lieutenant in their hands, they could now issue orders. The inmates made the lieutenant contact the guard at the main gate, just as they had planned. As we mentioned earlier, the lieutenant informed the gate guard that there was a bomb in Section C and ordered him to open both gates at once, allowing a van to enter the prison. The guard, believing it to be a genuine emergency, complied with the order without hesitation. The story takes a turn as the guard, who was responsible for the main gate, received an alarming message about a bomb in Section C. This message, sent by an unknown inmate 2 months earlier, had been part of a larger plan. We had previously discussed this message and the extensive searches that the guards had conducted in response. Now, with the added urgency of the situation, the message seemed more credible, especially since it had been sent by someone inside the prison, likely the inmates themselves, to plant the idea of a bomb in the guards' minds. When the time came for the escape, the plan was set into motion. The lieutenant, under duress, ordered the main gate to be opened. A prison van was brought in, and it made its way toward Building 1. Meanwhile, one of the inmates had taken a small television from one of the cells. The plan was to cover it with a blanket and pretend it was a bomb. It's important to note that not all of the inmates involved in the escape intended to flee. Some of them stayed behind to help manage the control rooms and open doors for the others. Not everyone wanted to escape, but they all wanted to be part of the action. The prison was a dull place, and anything that broke the monotony was welcomed. Even Willie Turner, the inmate believed to be the mastermind, didn't escape. He had an upcoming appeal for his death sentence and chose to stay behind, likely hoping for a favorable outcome. However, the 6 inmates who did escape, the ones we've been talking about, weren't just going to leave quietly. Before exiting the building, they raided a room containing riot gear, which was meant for the guards. They took helmets, shields, and even a stretcher, which they used to cover the television, making it appear like a bomb. When they donned the heavy riot gear, their identities were further concealed, making it easy for them to blend in. The guard at the main gate, unaware of what was truly happening inside, simply knew that there was a bomb threat. When the van pulled up, the inmates disguised in riot gear suddenly appeared, shouting at the guard to run because they had a live bomb that could explode at any moment. One of them even sprayed fire extinguisher foam to add to the illusion. The poor guard, terrified, believed them. He thought they were a special bomb squad or some kind of elite team. Without hesitation, he fled, leaving the inmates to continue their escape. After the escapees got into the van, they drove out of the prison gates with ease, as the gates were left open in front of them. This is the story of their escape, pieced together from the details gathered by investigators during their questioning of the guards. Eventually, the investigators began to suspect that one of the guards might have been working with the inmates. The real problem, however, was the guards' performance and the foolish mistakes they made, mistakes that the inmates knew exactly how to exploit. Unfortunately, despite gathering all these details from the guards, the investigators had no clue where the escapees had gone after they fled. The search outside the prison continued relentlessly, but 3 hours had passed since the escape, and there was still no sign of the prisoners. This meant they could have traveled a significant distance away from the prison. Now, let's look at the events from the perspective of the 6 escapees. After leaving the prison, they drove the van for a while, feeling the euphoria of their successful escape. It seemed this thrill made them forget that they were driving a prison van with the prison's logo and name clearly visible. As they drove, they passed a police officer on his usual night patrol. The officer saw them, and they waved at each other. You might wonder how the officer didn't realize they were the escapees, especially since every officer in the state was on the lookout for them. The reason? The officer was in a different state, North Carolina, not Virginia. The escapees had managed to cross the state line, and the news of the escape hadn't yet reached North Carolina, especially since this encounter happened within the first hour of the escape. The officer, seeing the prison van, assumed they were prison officers transporting inmates. Since prisoner transfers often happen at night to keep things discreet and secure, he didn't suspect anything. After the encounter with the officer, the escapees snapped out of their euphoria and realized the mistake they had made. They were still driving a prison van, and they needed to get rid of it before it exposed them. They started arguing among themselves about their next move and how they could get rid of the van. One of them suggested finding a forest and driving the van between the trees, covering it with branches. However, this plan would take time, and they were already anxious, fearing that someone might catch them because of the van. After driving a little further, they reached a small town called Winton. There, they spotted a secluded area between the trees and decided to park the van there and leave it behind. In a hurry, they got out of the van and split into 2 groups. The first group consisted of the 2 Braley brothers, along with Willie Jones and Liam Taggle. The second group included Earl Clant and Derek Peterson. The 4 in the first group continued running through the trees and woods. They got lucky when they found some clothes hanging on a clothesline in front of a house. They quickly stripped off their prison guard uniforms and changed into regular clothes to blend in better. By this point, 3.5 hours had passed since the escape began. Finally, after all that time, the police found their first clue. A patrol car was driving near the spot where the escapees had left the van. The news of the escape had spread, and even the police in North Carolina had received the updates. When the officer saw the van with the McLean Bridge prison logo on it, he immediately called for backup. The police arrived and cautiously approached the van, only to discover it was empty. They realized the escapees had abandoned it and were now on foot. Inside the van, they found the helmets and other items the inmates had used. The van was 50 kilometers away from the prison, which was outside the search zone the police had been focusing on. The news quickly reached the authorities, and the operation center for the search was moved to Winton, North Carolina, where the van had been found. The case became a joint operation between law enforcement agencies from both Virginia and North Carolina. Additionally, the FBI was called in to lead the investigation, as the escape had become a federal case since the prisoners had crossed state lines. The case was now under the FBI's control, and the search area was expanded to focus on the small town where the van had been found. Investigators quickly assumed that the escapees had split into smaller groups, as staying together in one group would increase the likelihood of them being caught. The logical conclusion was that they had separated. This information was broadcast to all law enforcement agencies across the state and country. The FBI warned security agencies nationwide, notifying them that 6 death row inmates had escaped and urging them to stay alert in case one of the fugitives entered their jurisdiction. At the operations center, the investigators were calculating distances, studying maps, and trying to predict the areas the escapees might reach with each passing minute. They also began gathering information about the prisoners, their families, and anyone who might have been in contact with them while they were incarcerated. The most likely scenario was that these criminals would turn to their families, relatives, or friends for help. In response, the police set up a dedicated hotline to receive tips about the fugitives. Around dawn, the police received a tip from a resident in the same small town, Winton, saying that a blue pickup truck had disappeared from in front of his house. The resident described the truck as having a red tint on the back with a distinctive license plate number BEE1. He also mentioned that the truck was full of fuel, which meant that if the escapees had stolen it, they could travel a long distance. The police immediately broadcast an alert for the vehicle, but they knew they had to expand the search area dramatically, potentially covering hundreds of kilometers. With the escapees now in possession of a vehicle, they could be anywhere, so it was essential to alert security agencies in neighboring states as well. As the sun rose, there was still no sign of the escapees, and the search continued. The police set up checkpoints on all roads, especially around the small town of Winton. Every vehicle was stopped and searched. All law enforcement officers in the area were recruited for the search, from traffic officers to special forces. There were no limits to the resources available, with helicopters in the air, officers patrolling the streets, and dogs sniffing for clues. Despite all these efforts, they still couldn't find any trace of the escapees. The massive search operation and the movement of security forces on such a large scale, however, had an unintended consequence. It terrified the town's residents. Imagine waking up to the sound of helicopters and police cars only to find checkpoints set up all over the streets. Then the news hit. 6 dangerous murderers had escaped from prison. These criminals had been in their town just the night before, and no one knew if they had already left or were still hiding nearby. The people of Winton were terrified. They feared for their lives, worried that they might run into one of these killers on the streets, killers who had nothing to lose and could kill anyone if they saw an opportunity. Even the people in neighboring towns were scared, as the criminals could be anywhere, and they were now on high alert. To make matters worse, the media began broadcasting details about the criminals' horrifying past. They spoke of brutal crimes, including assaults on elderly women in their 70s, the murder of entire families, and even the killing of a 5-year-old child in front of his parents. Imagine the fear gripping the people as they realized these killers could be right among them and they had no idea where they were. As the fear spread, the people of Winton and the surrounding areas rushed to gun stores in a panic, buying weapons and ammunition at an alarming rate. The demand was so high that the stores ran out of stock. Every gun and every bullet was sold out. The additional problem was that people were now afraid even of the police officers. Why? Because they knew the criminals had disguised themselves in guard uniforms. So how could they be sure that the officer in front of them wasn't one of the escapees? When the police would sometimes knock on doors to ask questions or investigate, they faced significant resistance. Many people refused to cooperate, and some wouldn't even open their doors. A lot of residents barricaded themselves inside their homes, locking the doors and refusing to open them for anyone. Some didn't even sleep for several nights, organizing shifts between family members so that at least one person was always awake, alert, and armed. The police were trying to help, especially the elderly and women who needed groceries or other supplies but were too scared to go out. Officers would assist by going to the stores or supermarkets to get these items for them. But in general, the fear in the town and surrounding areas was overwhelming. The police received an overwhelming number of calls, so many that they couldn't keep up. Every minute someone would call claiming they had seen one of the escapees somewhere. Then on June 1st, 1984, the day after the escape, at around 5 p.m., Earl Lanton and Derek Peterson were casually walking down the streets of the town in broad daylight. They seemed to have lost their fear, or perhaps they were trying to act confidently, as if walking openly down the street would make no one suspect them. They had discarded their guard uniforms except for one of them, Lanton, who kept his jacket but had removed the badge and any identifying marks from it, perhaps because he liked the jacket and wanted to keep it. The two of them entered a laundromat, a place where you could use coins to operate the washing machines. They weren't there to do laundry, though. They were looking for a place to hide and eat. They had food they had bought from a store, and they were starving. They searched for a quiet spot to eat, and after some looking around, decided the laundromat was the best option. It was hidden enough to give them some privacy. Unfortunately for them, at that very moment, a security patrol happened to pass by the laundromat. This wasn't just any regular police patrol, it was a team led by the head of the prison's emergency response unit. The leader of this unit was very familiar with prison guard uniforms. As soon as his eyes fell on the laundromat, he immediately noticed the jacket Lanton was wearing. Even though it didn't have the usual prison guard badges or insignia, he recognized it by its color and shape. He quickly turned the vehicle toward the laundromat, and he and his assistant got out, drew their weapons, and entered the store. Inside, they found Lanton and Peterson eating. The officer ordered them to raise their hands and press their faces against the wall. The two men's freedom outside lasted less than 19 hours, not even a full day. These are real moments captured from their arrest in the laundromat. As you can see, people and journalists gathered around the scene. While this should have been a cause for celebration, it was also frightening, especially for the town's residents. They realized that two of the most dangerous criminals were walking freely in their streets and stores. Even those who weren't scared before suddenly became terrified. They realized the criminals could be among them without them knowing. The investigators were particularly worried about the Braley brothers, who, as we mentioned earlier, were the most violent of the group. They were classified as serial killers, having committed repeated senseless murders and assaults. They had killed a pregnant woman, attacked a 79-year-old woman, and killed her along with her husband. They also murdered a 5-year-old child and his family, among other brutal and violent crimes. And the most chilling part? They showed no remorse whatsoever. Given their nature, the Braley brothers were at the top of the police's list. The search operations continued, but the police struggled with the overwhelming number of calls they were receiving. Despite the large number of reports, the security forces tried their best to follow up on as many of them as possible, especially those that seemed promising. They searched through forests, mud, swamps, lakes, and abandoned houses. No place was left unchecked. But despite all this effort, none of the reports led to anything useful in the end. Without the reports, the police continued their efforts. That night, at around 11 p.m. in Portsmouth, Virginia, about 300 miles away from Winton, a police patrol was driving down the road when they spotted two people trying to steal a car. One of the officers got out of the vehicle and ordered the criminals to raise their hands, but the two suddenly fled, and when the officer attempted to chase them, they fired at him. It was later confirmed that these two individuals were the Braley brothers. The gunfire confirmed the investigators' worst fears. These two were willing to kill even a police officer to maintain their freedom. They would not hesitate, as seen with the two criminals they had captured earlier. If they were willing to kill a cop, they would have no qualms about killing an ordinary citizen if they saw any benefit in doing so. It was clear now, the brothers were dangerous, and it was just a matter of time before they would kill again if they remained free. The second problem was that they had been spotted in a city 300 miles away from the search center in Winton, where the prison vehicle had been found. This meant the search in those areas was no longer useful, and the criminals had likely moved far away from those regions. The investigators now had to come up with new strategies to track them down. The first idea that came to mind was to monitor the people closest to them, like their family and relatives. The FBI went through the prison's phone records and reviewed the numbers and people the Braley brothers had been calling while inside. However, many of the names and numbers seemed random, and every time they checked a name or number, they found no connection to the brothers, suggesting the brothers had given false information to the prison authorities about who they were calling. The FBI then took the next step. They obtained the phone records directly from the phone company, which had the real names and numbers of the people the Braleys had been contacting. After reviewing the records, the investigators discovered that the person the brothers had contacted the most was their uncle. The FBI then went to the uncle's house, but decided to monitor him from a distance. They didn't approach him directly because doing so could raise suspicions, and if they alerted him, he might warn the brothers, allowing them to escape. So a team was assigned to keep a constant watch on the uncle, tracking his every move. The investigators knew that the Braley brothers were unlikely to stay at his house, but there could still be some form of contact or meeting between them. The plan was to keep watching the uncle until the moment he would contact or meet with the brothers. So they continued to monitor him, following his every move for several days. We'll return to their story later, but for now, let's shift focus to the other prisoners. During the days the FBI spent monitoring the uncle, the police got a new lead on the other criminals, Lim Taggle and Willie Jones. These two had taken 8 days to reach Vermont, where they hid in one of the forests. Vermont, located on the border with Canada, was their intended destination. They were trying to make it to Canada. In the forest, they spent their nights hiding, but they faced a problem. Their pickup truck was low on gas, and they needed to refuel to continue their journey. If you remember, they had stolen this truck the first night after abandoning the prison vehicle. The truck was taken from in front of a house in Winton, and the owner had reported it to the police. The truck was blue with a red tint at the back and had a distinctive license plate, BAE1. The next morning, after traveling some distance from Winton, the brothers split from Lim Taggle and Willie Jones. They said someone would meet them and they would go with him. Lim Taggle and Willie Jones took the truck and continued their journey toward Vermont. However, they needed gas. Lim Taggle left his partner Jones in the forest and drove to a nearby town, where he went into a gift shop. Inside the shop, he started talking to the owner, and moments later he pulled out a knife and demanded all the money she had. The shop owner had no choice but to comply, handing over the money. Lim Taggle ran out of the shop, jumped into the truck, and sped off. But the shop owner managed to get a good look at the vehicle and its license plate, BAE1. She immediately called the police and reported the incident. Lim Taggle had taken about $80. Not a large sum, but enough for gas to continue their journey to Canada. With that, they were able to get further away, leaving the shop and town behind. The plan was for Lim Taggle to return to his partner, Willie Jones, who was waiting in the forest. Together, they would head for Canada. Unfortunately for Lim, the police responded to the shop owner's call much faster than expected. Once the police received the report, they confirmed the vehicle was stolen and likely connected to the prison break at McLean, a story every officer in town had heard about. The town was small, with limited streets and few people. One officer in plain clothes was driving down the street when he spotted the stolen vehicle passing by in the opposite direction. He immediately turned around, activated his police lights, and began the pursuit. Lim, however, didn't stop. He kept speeding away, determined to escape. The officer, meanwhile, informed other police units about the chase. One officer, driving a patrol car, was close to their location and quickly moved to intercept the vehicle. His plan was to set up a roadblock, forcing the criminal to stop. The officer parked his car across the road and got out, aiming his weapon in the direction where he expected the criminal's vehicle to appear. The police were on high alert, knowing that this could be one of the escaped convicts, likely a death row inmate. The situation was tense, especially since this was a rural area not accustomed to high-speed chases or armed confrontations. The officer was ready to act. If Lim didn't stop, he would shoot to stop him before the criminal could use the vehicle as a weapon. Luckily for the police, Lim made the rational choice. When he saw the roadblock and the officer with his weapon drawn, he decided to stop. He realized that trying to escape further would be futile. Unlike the Braley brothers, who would have kept running, Lim surrendered. He was arrested by the police, and this moment of his capture was captured in a real photograph. Later, Lim expressed regret for robbing the shop, wishing he had chosen a different target. He even thought deep down that if he had killed the shop owner, she wouldn't have reported him, and he wouldn't have been caught. He didn't say this out loud, but it was likely in his mind. After all, this was a man sentenced to death for killing two elderly women. A person like him wouldn't hesitate to kill someone else if it served his interests. The following day, the police managed to arrest Willie Jones, who had been waiting for his partner in the forest. However, the way they caught him was unusual and surprising. You might think that his partner, Lim Taggle, betrayed him, but no. Willie turned himself in. That day, Willie called the emergency hotline and told the operator that he was Willie Jones, a death row inmate who had escaped from prison. He said he was tired and wanted to surrender. The operator was initially shocked and asked him where he was. Willie didn't know the exact location, but he gave a description of his surroundings, which allowed the operator to narrow it down. She told him, "We'll send a unit to pick you up. Please stand in a clear spot." Willie responded, "I'll wait by the side of the road." The police, following the directions, drove to the location described by the operator. As they approached, they saw Willie Jones standing by the side of the road, waving at them. It was a bizarre scene, an escaped death row inmate voluntarily surrendering to the police. He told them he was unarmed, and they cautiously approached him. Eventually, he was arrested. When the investigators sat down with him, their curiosity got the better of them, and they asked him why he turned himself in. Willie explained that he had been lost in the forest, waiting for his partner, Lim. But when an entire day passed without hearing from him, Willie assumed that either something had happened to Lim or that he had gone ahead to Canada alone. Confused and stuck in the forest, surrounded by biting insects and starving with nothing to eat, Willie reached a breaking point. He couldn't take it anymore and decided to surrender. What was truly tragic for Willie was discovering later that he had been just a few kilometers away from Canada. He could have easily walked there, as the border wasn't heavily guarded, only along the main highway. He could have crossed into Canada and started a new life with ease. But he didn't know that, and by the time he realized, it was too late. Now, 4 of the 6 prisoners were caught, but unfortunately the 2 most dangerous ones, the Braley brothers, were still free. The police interrogated Lim Taggle, asking him about their whereabouts. Lim admitted that they had been together on the first day and had stolen the pickup truck together, but after that, they had separated. He had no idea where the Braley brothers might have gone. At this point, the FBI had no leads left to track down the Braley brothers except for their uncle. As we mentioned earlier, they had been keeping a close eye on him, confident that the brothers would eventually contact him or that he might already be helping them. According to their investigation, the uncle was the most frequent contact the Braley brothers had from prison. So they continued to monitor him for several days, but each day brought no results. He neither contacted the brothers nor met with them. Finally, patience paid off. One day, while they were following him, they noticed he stopped at an auto body shop, a place specializing in car repairs and detailing. To their surprise, a woman came forward and reported that James Braley had called her. When the FBI traced the number, they found it led them to the same shop. It was no coincidence that the uncle had visited this particular place. It was clear the brothers had some connection to it. The shop owner, in fact, had met the Braley brothers through the uncle. The uncle had introduced them under fake names, never revealing their real identities. Because the uncle and the shop owner were friends, the uncle had asked the owner to hire the brothers. The FBI grew suspicious and decided to place a surveillance unit at the shop. They watched the place for days, but there were no significant developments until June 19th, 1984. On that day, a surveillance officer saw two men working on a car outside the shop. The men resembled the Braley brothers, but the investigators couldn't be sure of their identities. To confirm, they sent an informant, someone from the same neighborhood, to approach the men casually and talk to them. The informant blended in perfectly, speaking their language and using familiar expressions which didn't raise any suspicions. The informant returned and confirmed that one of the men was indeed James Braley, but the other wasn't his brother. Now the FBI had located James, but the problem was they didn't want to arrest him without knowing where his brother was. If the brother found out James had been caught, he would likely flee. At the same time, they were concerned that James might slip through their fingers, either by sensing danger or panicking and running. Fortunately, later that evening, they confirmed that his brother Leonard was also at the shop. It seemed they were hosting a small gathering with some of their friends and acquaintances. When the police confirmed that both of the Braley brothers were inside the shop, they immediately raided the place. Everyone was caught off guard, especially the Braley brothers. As the officers stormed in, they ordered everyone to get on the ground. Everyone complied, dropping to the floor immediately except for the Braley brothers. In shock, they stood frozen, unsure of what to do. In that moment, they were probably debating whether to surrender or try to escape, but the problem was, even if they tried to flee, the police had them surrounded from all sides, their weapons aimed at them. They knew they were wanted criminals, and any wrong move would result in gunfire. After a few tense moments, realizing there was no way out, they understood that any wrong move could lead to their deaths. They finally dropped to the ground, surrendering with the rest of the group. The scene was chaotic and loud, with even the shop owner who had been sitting in his office shocked by what was happening. The two brothers were arrested after a 19-day manhunt. Unfortunately, no one had been injured or killed during the pursuit. With the Braley brothers finally in custody, the authorities took extra precautions to ensure they would never escape again. The usual protocol would have been for the state, where they were arrested, to coordinate with the state they had escaped from, working out an arrangement to transfer them, but in this case, an exception was made. The FBI kept the Braley brothers under federal custody, making sure there was no chance of them escaping before being returned to Virginia. The McLean prison in Virginia was put on lockdown. No new prisoners were allowed in, and no prisoners were allowed out for any reason. The state governor announced the dismissal of 5 guards from their positions and suspended the prison warden and the assistant warden without pay indefinitely. The prison was in a state of turmoil, far from stable. After the escape, the prison descended into chaos. Riots broke out frequently, with one of the most shocking incidents being when inmates stabbed 2 guards with handmade knives. Riots were not uncommon in McLean prison, but after the escape, it seemed as though the prisoners developed a fervor for them. Riots became a daily occurrence, with major incidents happening regularly, whether between the inmates themselves or with the guards. This created an atmosphere of utter disorder in the prison, forcing the administration to make significant changes. Staff were dismissed and reassigned to different positions, but the prison remained unstable for quite some time. To prevent another escape, a series of new protocols were put in place. The bathroom doors were locked at all times. Inmates who needed to use the bathroom were given a key to unlock the door, use the facilities, and then lock it behind them. Any guard who failed to follow this new protocol was immediately fired. The prison also upgraded the external gates, installing an electronic system that ensured the two gates couldn't open simultaneously. One gate would only open if the other was securely closed. The administration enforced every rule and protocol with unwavering strictness, and any guard who violated these rules was dismissed without hesitation. As for the 6 escapees, their fate was sealed. After the escape, the state expedited the execution of death sentences. In the past, inmates could wait for years in prison, with appeals and sometimes retrials delaying their fate. But after the escape, officials decided to speed up the process. The first to be executed was Lino Brayley, who was electrocuted in 1984. 6 months later, his brother James Brayley followed him to the electric chair. During this time, several other inmates were also executed, and the rate of executions surged. The remaining 4 escapees didn't have much time left. Arl Clant was executed in 1988, followed by Derek Peterson in 1991. Willie Jones was executed in 1993, and all of them met their end in the electric chair. The last of the escapees, Lem Tegel, was executed in 1996. By then, the electric chair had been discontinued, and he was executed by lethal injection. And let's not forget about Willie Turner, the inmate who made the knives and was the mastermind behind the escape. He didn't escape with the others because he had an appeal for his death sentence. He hoped that this appeal might clear his name or reduce his sentence, but in the end, he too was executed in 1995, also by lethal injection. Every inmate who participated in the escape or was present in Section C eventually met the same fate, execution, sooner or later, and so we can say that justice took its course. This brings us to the end of our story. Honestly, this has been one of the most challenging videos I've worked on. The preparation took a long time, and now, as I'm filming, it's been hours. It was night when I started, and now it's day. If I were to tell you everything that happened during this filming, you wouldn't believe me. It was one of the worst filming sessions I've had. First, I had the camera plugged into the electricity, and halfway through filming, the power went out. The camera turned off while it was recording, and this caused some files to get corrupted. Some of the footage I had shot was lost, and I had to reshoot it. To prevent this from happening again, I disconnected the camera from the power source and put the battery in. I started recording again, but I forgot to press the record button. So I kept talking for about 10 minutes, not realizing the camera wasn't recording. When I finally noticed, I started recording, and thankfully everything went smoothly after that until the end of the video. By the time I reached the end of the video, the filming had taken so long that the camera's battery ran out, and I didn't have a screen to warn me about it. The camera turned off without me realizing, and I kept recording for the last 15 minutes of the video without knowing it wasn't working. When I realized, I plugged the camera back into the power source and recorded the final 15 minutes again. So if you could hit the like button to support all this effort, I would really appreciate it. And if you're not subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. If you still have the energy, check out these amazing previous videos. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye. 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 Goodbye.